Nobody in Caldwell Flats could explain why James Harvell stayed. They had all watched men try before, men with better boots, better bloodlines, and considerably better sense, and every single one of them had walked away from the Brighton ranch with their pride in pieces and their hats in their hands. Charlotte Brighton had a way of making a person feel small without raising her voice. She didn't need to. One look from her was enough. And yet, on a Thursday morning in late October, James Harvell rode through the front gate of the Brighton property, took one long look at the woman standing on the porch with her arms crossed and her expression set like cold iron, and decided without any apparent hesitation to climb down from his horse and ask Walter Brighton for work. The town had been talking about the Brighton ranch for as long as anyone could remember. Walter Brighton had built it from almost nothing. 40 years of hard decisions, dry summers, and a stubbornness that bordered on legendary. He owned more land than any 3 families combined in that part of the territory, ran over 400 head of cattle, and employed a rotating crew of ranch hands who came and went with the seasons. What didn't rotate was his daughter. Charlotte had grown up on that land, learned to ride before she could properly read, and somewhere along the way had decided that the world owed her a certain level of deference. Most people in Caldwell Flats simply gave it to her. James was not from Caldwell Flats. He had come down from the northern counties with a single saddlebag and a calm that people sometimes mistook for slowness, and a reputation, among the few who knew him, for being the kind of man who finished what he started. He was 31 years old. He had worked cattle ranches since he was 15. He was not looking for trouble, and he was not looking for conversation. He was looking for honest work and a fair wage. And Walter Brighton, who had just lost 2 experienced hands to a competing outfit near the river, was in a position to offer both. Charlotte was not consulted on the hiring. That, more than anything else, seemed to be the root of the problem. She came to find her father in the stable that afternoon, her boots sharp on the wooden floor, her voice carrying the particular tone she reserved for matters she considered beneath discussion. "You hired another drifter," she said, and it wasn't a question. Walter Brighton didn't look up from the harness he was mending. "I hired a ranch hand. There's a difference." "Not in my experience." He glanced up then, briefly. "Your experience is limited, Charlotte." She left without responding, which was its own kind of answer. James, who had been working quietly in the adjacent stall and heard every word, said nothing either. He kept his eyes on his work and his thoughts to himself. It was a habit that would serve him well in the months ahead. The Brighton ranch sat at the edge of a wide valley that turned gold in autumn and pale in winter and came back green every spring with a stubbornness that matched its owner. The main house was large by frontier standards. 2 stories, white painted, with a deep porch that wrapped around 3 sides. There were 4 outbuildings, just a bunkhouse that held 8 men comfortably, a smokehouse, and a barn that Walter Brighton kept in better condition than some men kept their homes. It was a serious place. Everything about it said that the people who lived here meant business. James settled into the rhythm of it within a week. He was not the kind of man who needed to announce himself. He worked steadily, learned the land quickly, and got along well enough with the other hands, a loose collection of men who had, to varying degrees, all developed the same strategy for dealing with Charlotte Brighton, which was to stay out of her way and agree with whatever she said when avoidance wasn't possible. James did not adopt this strategy. Not out of boldness, exactly. It was more that he simply didn't see the point. The first real exchange between them happened on a Wednesday, 11 days after he arrived. A section of the eastern fence line had come down overnight, and two of the younger hands had spent the better part of the morning arguing about the most efficient way to repair it. Charlotte had ridden out to check on the progress and found them still arguing, the fence still down, and 3 cattle standing at the gap with considerable interest in the open pasture beyond. She dismounted. Her expression suggested she was reconsidering her opinions on the intelligence of the human race. "Is there a reason this fence is still open?" she asked, addressing no one in particular and everyone at once. James was already pulling posts from the back of the supply wagon. He didn't look up. "There will be in about 20 minutes, he said. "Less, if those two stop talking." The younger hands went quiet. Charlotte turned to look at him with an expression that had ended more than one man's employment on this ranch. James met it briefly, then went back to the posts. She stood there for a moment. Then, without a word, she remounted and rode back toward the house. The younger hands looked at James as though he had just walked barefoot through a rattlesnake den and come out unbitten. He handed them each a post and told them to get to work. That evening, one of the older hands, a weathered man named Dooley, who had worked the Brighton ranch for 7 years, sat down beside James at the bunkhouse table and studied him with the careful expression of someone trying to determine whether a person was brave or simply uninformed. "You know who she is," Dooley said. It wasn't quite a question. "Rancher's daughter," James said. "No, Walter Brighton's only child," Dooley said. "Runs this place as much as he does. Has done since her mother passed." He paused. "She was 14 when that happened." James was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "How long ago was that?" 11 years, Dooley said. James nodded once and said nothing more, but something behind his eyes shifted, quietly, the way a door shifts when a draft moves through a room, not opening, not closing, just acknowledging that the air had changed. He lay awake that night longer than usual, staring at the ceiling of the bunkhouse while the other men slept. 14 years old. He thought about that. He thought about what it meant to lose the person who softened the world for you at an age when the world still needed softening, while he thought about what a person might build around themselves in the years that followed, and why, and what it might cost them. Outside, the wind moved across the valley floor and pressed itself against the walls of the bunkhouse like something that wanted to come in. James closed his eyes. He had no plan. He was not that kind of man. But somewhere between the fence line that morning and Dooley's quiet words that evening, something had settled in him, a patience, or perhaps a decision, so understated that he himself couldn't quite name it. He only knew that when Charlotte Brighton had turned that look on him and found nothing to push against, something in her expression had shifted. Just for a moment. Just enough. And in James Harvell's experience, but a moment was usually where everything began. Winter came to Caldwell Flats the way it always did, without apology. The valley that had glowed gold through October turned gray and hard by November, and the work on the Brighton ranch shifted from the open range to the closer, more deliberate labor of preparing for the cold. Fences needed reinforcing. Feed needed stacking. The cattle needed rotating to the lower pastures where the grass held a little longer before the frost took it completely. It was unglamorous work, the kind that revealed a man's character more honestly than anything else could, and James Harvell moved through it with the same unhurried steadiness that had already made him quietly indispensable to Walter Brighton. Walter noticed. He was the kind of man who noticed everything and commented on very little, yet which was perhaps where Charlotte had learned the habit. He started finding reasons to work alongside James, checking the southern water troughs, walking the fence line near the creek, reviewing the feed inventory in the barn. He never made it obvious. He simply appeared, looked at what James was doing, offered the occasional observation, and stayed longer than the task required. James understood what was happening and didn't make it awkward. He answered questions directly, asked a few of his own, and let the older man set the pace of whatever this was becoming. Charlotte watched all of it from a careful distance. She didn't trust it. That much was plain. She had watched men come through this ranch for years, men who were friendly with her father because they wanted something, or men who performed their work well for a season and then revealed themselves as temporary in one way or another. She had developed a precise internal system for categorizing people quickly, and the category she had prepared for James Harvell was one she'd used many times before: capable, self-interested, passing through. The problem was that he kept failing to behave accordingly. In early December, one of the ranch horses, a gray mare named Settler that Charlotte had owned since the animal was 2 years old, came up lame on a cold morning after catching her leg in a half-frozen rut near the barn. The ranch's regular horse doctor was 3 hours away and unreachable until the following day. Charlotte stood in the stall with the mare, her jaw tight, and her hands moving over the injured leg with a knowledge and a gentleness that she never showed in any other context. The other hands hovered at a respectful distance, offering nothing useful. James came in, assessed the situation without being asked, and spent the next 4 hours working alongside Charlotte in that stall, not taking over, not offering opinions she hadn't requested, simply doing what was needed when it was needed, and staying quiet the rest of the time. He had worked enough ranches to know horses, and his hands were steady and sure. By evening, Settler was standing more comfortably, the leg properly wrapped, the mare calm. Charlotte sat back against the stall wall afterward, more tired than she had intended to show. She looked at James across the dim light of the barn, and for a moment her expression was entirely unguarded, open in a way that seemed to surprise even her. "You've done this before," she said. "A few times," he said. She nodded slowly. Then the guard came back up, as smooth and automatic as a drawn curtain. She stood, brushed the straw from her coat, and walked out of the barn without another word. James watched her go. He didn't sigh. He didn't shake his head. He simply began cleaning up, methodically, the way he did everything. Dooley appeared in the barn doorway a few minutes later, having clearly witnessed the entire exit. He looked at James with an expression somewhere between sympathy and amusement. "Most men would have taken that as a sign," he said. "Sign of what?" James asked. Dooley opened his mouth, then closed it again. After a moment, he said, "She's not easy. A son." "I know," James said simply. He didn't elaborate, and Dooley, who had learned to read silences on this ranch the way other men read weather, understood that the conversation was finished. What Dooley didn't know, what nobody on the Brighton ranch knew except Walter, and Walter only partially, was what had happened to Charlotte in the years just after her mother died. She had been 14 when Eleanor Brighton passed, and the loss had carved something out of her that had never properly grown back. But it wasn't only grief that had shaped her into what she was. It was what had come after. There had been a young man. She had been 17, still raw from the loss of her mother, still learning what the world looked like from the inside of pain. He had been the son of a neighboring landowner, charming, well-dressed, and attentive in a way that Charlotte, starved for gentleness, had mistaken for genuine feeling. She had let her guard down completely. She had trusted him with things she had never spoken aloud to anyone. He had used every single one of them, not cruelly, exactly, more carelessly, the way people sometimes treat things they don't understand the value of. He had shared her confidences with others for the entertainment value of it. He had laughed at things she'd said in private. By the time it reached her ears, the damage was thorough and efficient. Charlotte Brighton had stood in the middle of it, at 17 years old, and made a decision so quietly that nobody around her even noticed she was making it. She decided that softness was a liability she could not afford. She had kept that decision for 11 years, and it had served her in many ways. It had also cost her in ways she had stopped counting. James knew none of the specific details, but he had lived long enough and paid attention carefully enough to recognize the particular quality of someone who had been hurt by their own openness. He had seen it in other people. He recognized the architecture of it, the sharp edges maintained at all times, the reflexive withdrawal the moment anything felt too close, the way Charlotte's voice went just slightly flatter whenever a conversation moved toward anything personal. He didn't try to dismantle any of it. He didn't press. He didn't maneuver. He simply kept showing up, the same way every day, and let her get used to him the way a wary animal gets used to a presence that has never once moved suddenly. Christmas passed quietly on the ranch, but Walter Brighton was not a festive man by nature, but he kept certain traditions: a decent meal, a small measure of whiskey for the hands, an evening where the work stopped early and the bunkhouse was warmer than usual. Charlotte sat at the main house table across from her father and ate her meal with the careful composure she brought to everything. Walter watched her the way he always did, with a love so steady and so undemonstrative that it sometimes looked, from the outside, like simple attention. After dinner, he sat on the porch despite the cold, as was his habit, and James, passing by on his way back to the bunkhouse, slowed without quite stopping. "Sit a minute," Walter said. James sat. They were quiet together for a while, which was comfortable enough. Then Walter said, without preamble, "She wasn't always like this." James waited. "Her mother was the softest woman I ever knew," Walter said. "Charlotte took after her when she was small, used to follow Eleanor everywhere, used to laugh at everything." He paused. "Grief changes people, but it wasn't only the grief." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. James understood that this was not a complete story being offered. It was a door, cracked open just enough to suggest that there was more on the other side, left to James's judgment whether to walk toward it or not. "She's a good woman," James said quietly, "under all of it." Walter looked at him for a long moment. Something in the older man's expression settled, like a question that had been waiting a long time for a reasonable answer. "Yes," he said simply. "She is." He stood, nodded once, and went inside. James sat on the porch alone for a while after that, watching the cold sky over the valley. The stars were very clear and very far away. Somewhere in the main house, a lamp moved from one window to another. Charlotte, making her way through the rooms of the house she had grown up in, carrying her light from place to place in the dark. He watched until the last window went still. Then he walked back to the bunkhouse and lay down and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Walter Brighton had not said just as carefully as he thought about what he had. By January, something had shifted between James and Charlotte. Not dramatically, not in any way either of them had announced, or perhaps even fully acknowledged. It was more like the way a room feels different after someone has quietly rearranged the furniture in the night. Though everything was in a slightly different place. Nothing had been named. She had started speaking to him directly rather than through the other hands. Small things. A question about the feed rotation, a comment about the condition of the south pasture fence. Her voice, when she addressed him, had lost its sharpest edge, though it kept its precision. She was not warm. She was not what anyone would call approachable, but she was, unmistakably, present with him in a way she was not present with anyone else on the ranch. James noticed. He gave no indication that he noticed. This, more than anything else he had done, seemed to unsettle her. One afternoon in late January, she came across him alone at the water trough near the east barn, repairing a cracked timber in the frame, and she stood watching him work for longer than any practical reason justified. He was aware of her standing there and said nothing about it. Finally, she said, "You're not what I expected." He kept working. "What did you expect?" She was quiet for a moment. "Someone easier to dismiss," she said, and there was something in her voice when she said it. Not softness exactly, but the faint outline of where softness used to live, like an old mark on a wall where a picture once hung. James set down his tool and looked at her directly, not with challenge, not with anything that required a response, just with the steady, unhurried attention he brought to everything. "I'm not planning on being dismissed," he said. Charlotte Brighton held his gaze for 3 full seconds, which, for her, was the equivalent of a confession. And then she turned and walked away. But her steps, just for a moment, were slower than usual. And this time, James allowed himself the smallest of smiles. There, in the cold afternoon, with no one watching. Something was thawing in that valley. It was moving slowly, the way real things move, without fanfare, without any promise of what it would look like when it was done. But it was moving. February on the Brighton Ranch was the quietest month, the kind of quiet that had weight to it, that pressed down on the mornings and made the afternoons feel longer than they were. The cattle were settled in the lower pastures. The heavy repair work was done. The hands moved through their days with the slower, more deliberate pace that deep winter demanded, and the valley sat under a pale sky that couldn't quite decide between cloud and clear. And it was in this quietness that everything came to a head. It started, as most things do, not with a dramatic event, but with a small one. Charlotte had ridden out alone to check the northern boundary, something she did regularly and without informing anyone, which had been a source of low-level tension between her and her father for years. The temperature had dropped sharply overnight, and by mid-morning, the trail back from the northern fence had turned genuinely treacherous, a thin sheet of ice beneath a deceptive layer of fresh snow that looked solid and wasn't. Settler, still favoring her previously injured leg in cold weather, slipped on a hidden drop in the trail. She didn't fall completely, but the recovery was hard and sudden, and Charlotte came off. She landed in the snow on a slope that was steeper than it looked from above, and by the time she stopped sliding, she was 30 feet from her horse, cold and shaken, and with her left ankle twisted badly enough that standing on it sent a sharp, clear pain straight up her leg. She sat in the snow and assessed her situation with the same expressionless practicality she brought to everything. Settler was standing, unhurt, 20 feet up the slope. The ranch was a 40-minute ride. She could not ride with any reliability on this ankle. The temperature was still dropping. She was not frightened. She was, however, for the first time in a very long while, genuinely uncertain about what came next. James had noticed her absence by late morning, and he hadn't said anything immediately. Charlotte came and went as she pleased, and didn't appreciate being tracked. But by the time midday passed, and the temperature on the ranch thermometer had dropped another 4 degrees, he saddled his horse without explanation and rode north. He found her 40 minutes later, sitting upright in the snow with her back against a rock, and her expression set in a way that made it very clear she had been rehearsing how to receive help without appearing to need it. He dismounted. He looked at her ankle. He looked at the slope. He looked at the sky. "Can you stand on it?" he asked. "Partially," she said. He nodded. He helped her up without making a production of it, got her onto his horse with a minimum of fuss, collected Settler's reins, and started back toward the ranch at a careful pace. But they rode in silence for several minutes. The snow fell lightly around them, unhurried. "You didn't have to come," Charlotte said finally. "I know," James said. Another silence. Then, quietly, so quietly that the wind nearly took it, she said, "How did you know where to look?" "I pay attention," he said. She didn't respond to that, but she didn't look away from the trail ahead either, and something in the set of her shoulders was different from usual, less deliberately constructed somehow, like a sentence that had forgotten to finish itself. Walter Brighton met them at the gate. He took one look at his daughter's ankle, at James's calm expression, and at the particular quality of the silence between them, and understood several things simultaneously. He helped Charlotte inside without comment, which was its own form of grace. That evening, James sat alone in the barn, checking the horses before bed. His habit, the last task of every day. He heard footsteps on the barn floor and looked up. Charlotte stood in the doorway. She was walking with a careful step, her ankle wrapped, and she was holding 2 cups of coffee with the slightly self-conscious air of someone who had decided to do something before they could think themselves out of it. She crossed the barn and held 1 cup out to him. He took it. She sat down on the bench across from him without being invited, which meant she had stopped waiting for permission to be somewhere, at least here, at least with him. That was not a small thing. They drank their coffee in the dim light of the barn. Outside, the wind had settled. The horses shifted quietly in their stalls. "Dooley says you turned down an offer," Charlotte said. "From the Harvell outfit near the river. Better wages." James looked at his cup. "Dooley talks too much." "He does," she agreed. "Why did you turn it down?" James was quiet for a moment. He turned the cup in his hands the way he always did when he was choosing his words carefully. "Because I'm not finished here," he said. Charlotte looked at him steadily. The barn light was soft and honest, and there was nowhere to redirect her gaze. "What does that mean?" she asked, and her voice had none of its usual armor in it. It was just a voice, just a question, just a woman sitting in a barn on a winter evening asking the only thing she actually wanted to know. James set his cup down. He looked at her directly, the way he always did, it with that unhurried attention that had never once felt like pressure. "It means I came here for work," he said, "and somewhere along the way, I found something worth staying for that had nothing to do with the cattle." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when something true has been said, and the air needs a moment to settle around it. Charlotte looked down at her cup. A muscle in her jaw moved. When she looked back up, her eyes were steady, but there was something working behind them. Not quite emotion, but the place where emotion lives just before it becomes undeniable. "I'm not easy," she said. "I know," he said. "You've mentioned that, more or less." Something flickered across her face. Not quite a smile. The ancestor of one. "And that doesn't concern you?" "Not particularly," he said. Easy isn't what I'm looking for." She was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that the barn settled into its nighttime sounds around them. The small movements of horses, the distant call of something in the dark valley. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than usual, and more careful, in the way that careful means something different from guarded. "There was someone," she said. "When I was 17. James said nothing. He simply stayed present, the way he always did, fully, without demand. She told him, not everything, not all at once, but enough. The words came out in the measured, deliberate way of someone releasing something they have carried for a long time and are not entirely sure they remember how to put down. That she told him about the young man and the misplaced trust, and what it had cost her to find out what he'd done with it. She told him without self-pity, which made it harder to hear, not easier. Pain described without decoration is the most honest kind. James listened to all of it. When she finished, he didn't rush to fill the space with reassurance. He sat with what she'd said and let it be what it was. Then he said, "He was careless with something valuable. That says everything about him and nothing about you." Charlotte Brighton looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that a landscape changes when the cloud cover finally breaks and the light comes through at a new angle, changing the appearance of things that have been there all along. "You're a strange man." "James Harvell," she said. "So I've been told," he said. This time the smile came, small and brief and entirely real. It changed her face in a way that made James understand, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly why he had turned down the offer from the Harvell outfit, and every other reason he might have had to leave. Spring came to the Brighton Valley, the way it always did. Insistent and incremental, pushing up through the cold ground with a patience that made winter feel, in retrospect, like something that had never intended to stay. The cattle moved back to the upper pastures. The days lengthened. The ranch returned to its full, purposeful rhythm. Walter Brighton sat on his porch one April evening and watched his daughter walk across the yard beside James Harvell, the two of them talking in the low, unhurried way of people who have learned each other's silences as well as their words. Charlotte said something he couldn't hear, and James laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, and she looked sideways at him, with an expression Walter Brighton had not seen on his daughter's face in 11 years. He recognized it because it was her mother's expression. Eleanor had worn it in the same way, that particular look of someone who has found a place to set down what they've been carrying. Walter Brighton sat very still on his porch and let himself feel the full weight of that moment, without looking away from it. They were married in September, on the ranch, under a sky so clear and blue it looked deliberate. Walter Brighton stood beside his daughter at the ceremony, with the straightest back he had maintained in years, and an expression that remained composed, right up until it didn't. Charlotte wore a dress the color of winter wheat, and when she looked at James at the front of that gathering of people, her expression was open in a way that she had spent 11 years making sure no one ever saw. James looked back at her with the same steady, unhurried attention he had brought to everything from the first morning he rode through that gate, only now it carried the full weight of what it had become, which was something neither of them had a word for, and neither of them needed one. Dooley stood in the back of the gathering and pretended, without much success, that the dust was bothering his eyes. In the years that followed, the Brighton Ranch became the Harvell Brighton Ranch, though most people in Caldwell Flats simply called it the Harvell Place eventually, which Walter considered the highest possible endorsement. James ran the operation with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. Charlotte ran it alongside him with the same sharp intelligence she had always had, only now it was directed outward rather than used as a wall. They had 2 children, a boy first, then a girl. The boy had his father's steadiness and his mother's eyes. The girl had her mother's precision and, unmistakably, her father's laugh. Charlotte, watching them one evening from the porch as the children chased the last of the daylight across the yard, felt something she had no previous reference for, a fullness that had no sharp edges to it, a no place where it gave way to something harder. She had spent so long braced for the world that she had forgotten the world could simply be this: a porch, an evening, children running, a man's hand finding hers in the fading light without any preamble or announcement, because some things, after long enough, require neither. She turned to look at James. He was watching the children with a quiet satisfaction that was, she had come to understand, his natural state, his default expression when life was exactly what it should be. "You knew," she said, "didn't you, from very early on?" He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "I knew it was worth finding out," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the yard where the children were still running, and she let herself lean, just slightly, or against his shoulder, on the porch of the ranch that Walter Brighton had built from almost nothing, in a valley that had seen 40 years of hard seasons and honest work. The last of the light moved slowly across the land, and the evening came in soft and without hurry, the way the best things always do. If you find yourself drawn to slow-burn Western stories, the kind where the real drama lives in a glance, a silence, or a decision made quietly in the dark, there are more waiting for you here. Take your time with them.